How's everybody doing? Hi, how you doing? Holy cow, thanks. Oh, stop it, kids. Stop it, kids. Welcome to the July 4th lecture here on July 2nd. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's good to see everybody. I hope you're having a great day. It's fantastic. Good to see you. Yeah, I know. What do you think, Renee? I shaved it off. I got crazy, man. I decided to do this is in honor of all the troops on July 4th. I went with the boot camp buzz cut. I did this because it's cool. It feels comfortable, a little bit dangerous, and the best part is my wife doesn't like it. Oh yeah, pays off in spades. Thank you very much, Renee. I appreciate that. I think this is going to be my new look for a while. So I hope everybody's doing well. I just wanted to make a quick note. The wife has told me that we are going out of town tomorrow. Yay. So I am canceling this week's Friday webinar. I'm going to send an email out about it. I'm going to send a text out about it. All right. So you're going to have to do the weekly discussion board this week. Okay. Is everybody clear on that? Hi, Sean. Good to see you. Good to see you, Donnie. Kayla, good to see you back. Holy cow. We've got the same gang here. All right. Is everybody clear on that? I'm going to go ahead and get started with lecture today. So we're going to be finishing up Motivation and Emotion, Chapter 9 today. We're going to be talking specifically about emotions. What we'll cover today, I'm going to briefly introduce why emotions are important for you and how we describe them. We're going to talk about 3 classic theories of emotions. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the physiology of emotion, and then we're going to talk about displaying emotions and what it can help you do if you want to try to figure out who's telling you the truth or not. It's good to see you, Needy. Welcome to class. We were just discussing the fact that the Friday webinar is canceled for tomorrow, so you're going to need to do the discussion board in order to get credit for the collaboration this week, okay? Any questions? So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about emotions. Now, emotions are super important. They are, from an evolutionary perspective, they are very valuable because they allow us to become more complex as functioning individuals. So if it was only simple reflexes, reflex behaviors, or simple learning operant in classical conditionings, we wouldn't really be able to respond in quite a complex a manner as we do now. Now what we can do is we can use emotions to label events, situations, and feelings that allow us to give a more sophisticated appraisal of our environment, and they allow us to evaluate environmental events. So in a sense, what they do is they sort of give us an idea of what it is we like and want to do, and what it is we don't like and what we don't want to do. So think of your emotions, these evaluative concepts, as sort of providing the direction. What is it I'm going to be motivated about? Without emotions, we wouldn't have any way to decide which direction we wanted to go. You might have a motivation, but you wouldn't have a direction, right? Now, why are emotions important? They help self-regulate. If I'm feeling angry, that helps me to interpret my particular environment. If I'm happy, that allows me to interpret my behavior in this particular environment. So emotions provide information to me that help me to regulate my behavior. What am I going to do? What am I going to say? Where am I going to go? If something makes me feel scared, I self-regulate away. If something makes me feel aroused or happy or excited, I regulate myself towards it, right? And you know what? Emotions are actually important as social displays too. If you've ever been around somebody who gets super angry really quick, you know that their facial expressions can tell you that you need to clear the area, right? If you meet a strange person for the first time and they've got this look, you know you better get away from that person. On the other hand, if you run into a stranger and they give you this, you know that maybe you should stay around and talk to them. So emotions also act as social interaction regulators, if you will. What parts of our nervous system are involved in the emotional response? Remember, we're going to keep hitting back on this theory of modularity and interconnectedness, right? Because there are different areas of the brain that are responsible for, specific areas that are responsible for creating our full emotional experience, right? Modularity, and they work together in a connected sense. Your amygdala, which tells you if you're super happy or super angry. Your frontal lobe, which allows you to think more deeply about these stimuli to decide if you really are angry or really are happy. And your temporal lobes, which is where you store all the images that you either like or don't like, feel good about or don't feel good about. Good morning, Ashley. Good to see you. We were just talking a little bit about the purposes of emotions. And if you think about it, why do babies cry? If any of you have children, been around children, little brothers or sisters, you know that kids are freaking crybabies. That's all they do. Number one, it communicates with us. It's a way for them to regulate their social interaction when they don't have the ability to talk. Important. And number two, the problem is they don't have the ability to calm their emotions down. You may feel a certain way, but then you have this thing called your frontal lobe, which allows you to moderate your emotional response. Little babies don't have their frontal lobes online yet. So when they feel these basic emotions well up in them, they don't have the ability to control their emotional responses. How many of you have ever been angry and forcefully controlled your anger? How many of you have wanted to cry but didn't because it wasn't appropriate, right? And so little babies don't have this interconnectedness between their control center and their emotional center. Okay? Now, what is an emotion? Hard to say. Let's go with a working definition. Nobody really agrees because an emotion is kind of a slippery thing, but it's sort of this biological state that's characterized by neurological changes in the brain. Different parts of your brain become active that lead to characteristic patterns of feeling. So I like you, don't like you. Thoughts, you're dangerous, you're not dangerous. And activity. I'm going to run towards you or I'm going to run away from you. So it's sort of a biological state that creates a feeling, a thought, and potentially a behavior. Some people talk about emotions as moods. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about temperament or disposition or motivation. These are all terms that sort of capture what we will call this emotional content, this feeling of arousal and cognition that we have. So emotions, a blend of physiology and cognition. Now, it may be hard to explain an emotion, describe an emotion, right? Or define an emotion, I should say. But every definition agrees that emotions kind of have these two basic components. They have a valence. It's either a happy or an angry, either a moving towards or a moving away, right? So the emotions you feel either make you want to go forward or make you want to go away, or sometimes go forward to destroy, right? So they have a directionality. And then emotions also have a level of energy. Some emotions like fear and terror have a high level of energy, and some emotions like sadness and depression have a low level of energy. So when people try to sort of organize and think about emotions, they think of this emotional wheel that you sort of have here on the screen with you. And it sort of organizes the emotions we may feel in terms of whether or not they have activity or whether or not they have positive or negative polarity, right? So you can think excited, you're both aroused and positive, right? Stressed is aroused, but in a negative sense, right? And so you can sort of see that this captures the two important qualities of emotions. Now, if you hear me talking, you hear me talking about physiology, arousal level, and then you're also hearing me talk a lot about thoughts. And I'd like to ask you the chicken and the egg question. Which comes first? The idea that something makes you angry and then the emotional response? Or do you have the physiological response first and that causes you to have the angry thoughts? Which comes first? The thought or the feeling of emotions? And this was sort of the big debate regarding emotions back in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And in fact, I'm going to reintroduce a father of psychology right now. If you remember William James, one of the fathers of psychology, who wrote the first psychology textbook, he had a theory about emotions because he realized that emotions came with ideas, cognition, and they also came with physiological responses. If you've ever been afraid and had the hairs on your arms stand up, you know what I'm talking about. If you've ever been afraid and had your heart beating like it was going to come out of your chest, you know exactly what I'm talking about with regard to arousal. And so his theory was that what happens is that we experience an emotional state of arousal, a bodily state that occurs. Our heart starts beating really fast, our lungs start breathing, and then that goes up to our brain and causes us to feel the cognitive emotion of fear. And so he would argue, why are you afraid? It's because my heart is beating. Why are you happy? Or why are you embarrassed? It's because my face is flushed. So he would argue that the physiological response leads us to have the cognitive, the intellectual experience of emotion. And in fact, there's this really neat experiment that sort of backs up his approach. What they'll do is, oops, hold on, I don't have a pencil. I wanted to show you this. Hold on. They did this cool experiment in the 60s where they had people read funny comics. But they had them read the comics with a pencil, and they had them read the comics with the pencil in one of two ways. They had them read it with the pencil between their teeth, which is kind of a smile, or they had them read the comic strip with the pencil between their lip and their nose. And what kind of emotion is that? And they then had the people rate how humorous they thought the comic strips were. And it turns out people who read the comic books, exactly, the people who were making the smiling face while they read the comic book were more happy than the people who read the comics while they had the frown on their face. So sort of the upshot from this theory, KB, is right. You know what? Put a smile on your face and it will bring happiness to your brain. That's sort of their theory. Put a frown on your face and that will cause you to have sad thoughts. Now, Walter Cannon, who is actually famous because he is the guy who coined the term fight or flight response. Walter Cannon, way back in the day, he actually was the first to realize that we had this arousal response and that it caused this cascade of changes all over the body. And he called this the fight or flight response. He had a different theory instead. He argued that, yeah, our brain may activate our biological system, so we may start breathing fast. Our face may flush if we're embarrassed, but at the same time, we are also having the thought. And so he argued that the physiological response and the cognitive experience occurred at the same time. And he argued that emotion really is a combined thing. Oh, no problem. Good to see you, Sarah. We're just talking about emotions, and I'm comparing two ideas of emotion. How do we have emotions? Does your heart start beating fast and then your brain interprets that as fear? Or do you have the beating heart and the thoughts of fear at the same time? James Long would argue that the beating heart causes you to have fearful thoughts, and Canon Bard said it happens too quickly that you have them at the same time. Now, the reason I tell you these two is because I want to contrast them with the social psychological theory that is even crazier. You know what? The difference between the Schachter and Singer two-factor theory would argue that really the difference between emotions sometimes is just the label we attach to physiological responses. So sometimes being angry and being happy really have sort of the same experience. Your face gets flushed, your heart may start beating fast, your breathing may activate, but you know what? In one sense, you're having the greatest time of your life, and in the other sense, you're having the worst time of your life. If you've ever been around a little baby, an infant, a toddler that falls and hurts themselves, maybe they fall and hit their head. I don't know if you've had a toddler fall, hit their head, and they get up and they look at you. And you can act one of two ways. You can start laughing, and the toddler will start laughing. Or if you go, "Oh my God, baby, are you okay?" the toddler will start crying. It's my belief sometimes that the emotional responses we have are the same for different emotional responses. The reason we come to different cognitive experiences of emotions is because we interpret the environment we're in. Exactly, Sarah. So when they hit their head, their heart's going to start beating fast, and they're like, "Oh my God, am I scared or am I happy?" And they look around their environment, and if you're happy, they may get happy. That's the focus of this really cool experiment. Nice landing with a smile. Exactly, KB. That's the way to do it. This guy, Stanley Schachter, super famous social psychologist, did this experiment to prove sort of this tenuous link between physiological experience of an emotion and the cognitive experience of an emotion. So he brought people into his experiment one at a time, and he had them take a pill. He did this experiment in the 60s. You couldn't do this now. But the pill was an adrenaline pill. And you folks know what adrenaline does, right? It's a speed pill. It causes your heart to start beating fast and your face gets a little flushed. Now, people came into the experiment and they either took an adrenaline pill or they took a sugar pill. He said, "You know what? We're going to start this experiment in 10 minutes. I need you to fill out a questionnaire." And he sent them into a room where another person was sitting. Now, this person was supposedly in the experiment too, but they were actually working for Stanley Schachter. And they were instructed to do one of two things: to act really angry or to act really happy. And then at the end of this 10-minute period, he handed the participants a questionnaire and asked them to rate how happy or sad they were. Now, he gave some of the people he gave sugar pills. And he exposed them to the angry model or the happy model. But these people had no arousal, and so he found when he asked them if they were happy or they were sad, they reported the same level of happiness. Their emotions didn't change, and that's because they didn't have the physiological response. But he had a big difference for the people who took the adrenaline pill. Now, presumably, everybody who took the adrenaline pill started to feel its effects when they were sitting in the room with the model. Your heart starts beating fast, your face starts flushing. Now, in one situation, the model is getting angry. So the person says, "Why is my heart beating fast? I must be angry." In the other situation, the model says, "My heart's beating fast. I wonder why." and they see a person acting happy. And what he found was that these people's final emotional experience differed based upon whether or not they were around the happy model or the sad model. Kind of bizarre, isn't it? Exactly, Kayla. And this is sort of what I'm going to talk about in the very next slide. That's a great point, Kayla, what you're mentioning, the insight. So emotions are a combination of physiological response and a cognitive label, controlled by different modules of the brain. If you apply the concepts of neuroplasticity and critical periods, what you can do is you can think about the early childhood as a time when you teach kids how to have healthier emotions, right? Because what you're doing is you're building up these neural pathways that will help them associate different physiological responses and different cognitive labels with the events that happen to them in their life. Check this out. I've got a couple of different mothers who I know. One's a former student, one is a colleague, and I've talked to these moms, and I don't say anything because I don't want to judge anybody's motherhood, but these moms are super duper upset about telling their kids no. And their logic is a good mother doesn't make their child cry by disappointing them. And so these two moms, I would say, are rather passive and spoil their toddlers because they are afraid to tell them no. And no makes you feel disappointed, right? And a little bit angry. And so what I would suggest is that these ladies are building the neural pathways that will allow these kids to have really, really negative responses in life when things don't go their way. I don't know about you, but I am a fairly successful professional 50-year-old, and I have bad experiences almost every day. I suck at my job one way or another almost every day. I've been raising kids for almost 20 years now, and I make a mistake every day. The grocery store clerk pisses me off every day. In fact, no is really the most common thing I hear. I've applied for 10 financial grants to support my research and teaching. I've been turned down 9 times out of 10, right? So in a sense, one of the things that I think you can do to help your child is to build the ability, the neural ability to control their emotions a little bit, right? The Kayla Atnip's concurring with me. They don't learn how to process emotions that they will have, and they start to hear no, and the emotions will be overwhelming. Yes, and you know what? One of the things when I teach my developmental psych class, 241, I hope you folks take my developmental psych class in the fall. But one of the things that you are supposed to do as a parent is to coach your children through their first emotional experiences, helping them label, understand, and deal with their emotional responses. 3-year-olds get super pissed. You have to help them to understand how it's okay to take turns to not get something. You know what I mean? You have to learn how to deal with these emotions. And it's really important that you help children label these emotions. Just like you help them label words that they're going to use. That's a train, that's a car, that's a dog, that's a phone. You have to help them label these emotional responses that they feel. Not only label the things they see, but label the things they feel, and help them build strategies to help manage these emotional responses. Right. Well, you know, the thing is, they call them their terrible twos, and that's because a kid has autonomy. They can now move around and make volitional choices. I would argue to you that 6-month-olds are a pain in the ass too. All they do is cry. But they can't do anything but lay around. You know what I mean? So we don't call that terrible. But I would argue that both of these groups do not have control over their amygdala. They haven't connected their amygdala to their frontal lobe yet, right? And so the emotional responses that their amygdala generates, they are overwhelmed by and unable to control. Now, in their terrible twos, kids now can walk and talk, and they've developed a little bit of self-concept, so they can defy you now. And so their emotional under control is now elevated by their abilities, you know what I mean, to move around. But the point is, you are still trying to help build those neural pathways between their frontal lobe and their emotional center. Now, until the myelination occurs, they call it the terrible twos because kids that pathway isn't myelinated, so they have a lot of difficulty. But some parents say, you know what, I'm going to accept and live with that behavior, and they don't try to coach the kids. Now, I'm not talking about beating your kid's butt or getting angry, but I'm just talking about helping kids label and understand that it's okay to have those emotional responses. Does that make sense? That's a really long answer to a very short question. I apologize for that. Okay, now, I told you at the beginning that emotions are also important as a channel for social information. Not only are emotions useful for you, learning how to understand what your body's feeling and to pick things to go towards and to pick things to go away from, but emotions are great social indicators because they tell you what the person is feeling, and it allows you maybe to predict their behavior. If a person has a super angry look on their face and has a pistol, you know that it might be time to clear the area, right? And so emotions are very, very important. Now, this fellow named Paul Ekman, he is a world-renowned expert on facial expressions and, most importantly, lie detection. He has been hired by the military and police, the FBI, because he knows how to interrogate people and find out if they're lying. In fact, he's got this lab. I'm not sure if it's still open, but you can go into this lab and he'll give you $50. He puts $50 in an envelope, and if you can lie to him about whether or not you took the money and get away with it, he'll let you keep the money. But nobody ever gets away with the money because he can always tell if you're lying. Now, he is a young guy. He did this really cool experiment. He wanted to see if there were universal facial expressions. So he took pictures of American faces and he went over to the darkest jungles of Africa and found tribes that had never had interactions with outside people. And he showed them these faces and asked them to interpret the emotions. And what he found was that there were 7 universal emotional expressions that seemed to go everywhere in the world. Now, it turns out that lots of different hand gestures, colors, symbols that we have, they're very culturally bound. And in fact, you can do this in the United States, and this means, hey, everything's cool. But if you do this in some Asian countries, it means up your ass, right? And so symbols, colors, flags, all of these are culturally bound. But it turns out that ways to move your face, there are 7 universal facial expressions that are identified everywhere. So if you find yourself dropped off somewhere in a strange part of the world, don't move your hands or your body, but you can convey emotion universally using these 7 universal emotions. And so if you look in the top left, we have anger. Then in the top middle, we have fear. Then you'll notice we have disgust right there. See the pinched nose and the mouth going up on both sides. And then you'll see we have, actually that's surprise in the bottom left. See the eyes are wide open and the mouth is open. Okay, you'll notice happiness in the bottom middle with this gap-toothed fellow. The cheeks are raised up, the eyes are crinkled right around the eyes, the muscles are crinkled, and the face is brought up on both sides. And then you see bottom right, this lady is very, very sad. Now it turns out that contempt, hold on, let me see if I can show you contempt real quick. Okay, contempt is this. With contempt, only half of your face comes up. So disgust is, you stink, right? Contempt is like, whatever. See how half of my face rises up? You do that when you think somebody is beneath you. You're like, yeah, right, dude. And it turns out that these 7 facial expressions are universal. When they pop out of people's faces, you know that they're having these expressions. However, and in private settings, however, what Paul Ekman found was that there were display rules that varied by country that determined what basic emotion you showed in public. So, if you make somebody angry in private anywhere around the world, they'll show you their angry face. But in public, if you make them angry, they will show you the face that is appropriate for their particular culture. So, in some, and a lot of research focuses on East-West differences. So, if your boss is cursing you out and giving you the business in a Western country, your face is going to look sort of sadness or disgust or not happy or anger, right? But on the other hand, if you're getting the business from your boss in an Eastern country, in an Asian country, you might smile as if you're having the time of your life. And this would be the difference between private emotion, where we have these 7 basic emotions that we always show, versus the display rules, where we decide what emotions we are going to show. Now, the one final thing I will tell you is this guy, Paul Ekman, is super famous because he realized that even though we control our emotions with our frontal lobe, so even though I know I'm supposed to be pissed off at you, I'm smiling, what he found is that our amygdala causes these teeny tiny physiological clues about our real emotions to slip out for just a second. So even though you may be trying to hide your emotion, what he found is that he can catch most liars because a micro expression will slip out for just a second. So if you meet somebody you really freaking hate and you walk up and they're like, "Hi, Chris," you'll go, you know what I mean? You'll show that micro expression for just a second. Now, it's way quicker than I showed it here because you're not experts at identifying it, and I'm not an expert at faking my emotions purposefully. But what he found is that he can tell when people are lying because they engage in these nonverbal slippage of emotions. Now, the emotions don't tell you exactly what the person is lying about, but if you understand the situation and the context, and you can begin to see, you can begin to use these emotional slippages to make accurate guesses about what they're lying about and how they're lying. Does that make sense? I hope I haven't lost you with this discussion. Okay, oh my goodness. All right. Well, I tell you what, that's enough about emotions. Next week, we're going to talk about sex, gender, and stress. And I'm going to show you how to have the happiest life ever. Okay? Remember, there will be no webinar, no Friday webinar tomorrow. Instead, you will have to you'll have to do the discussion board for attendance credit. Any questions? Do the discussion board, okay? Do the discussion board. If you don't have any questions, I'm going to say goodbye. It was great talking to you. Happy 4th of July. Stay safe and have yourself a little bit of fun.
Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please consult your directory and call again, or ask your operator for assistance. This is a recording.